Hi class, this is course 3, lesson 35, adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing decimal numbers. So first we're going to talk about adding and subtracting decimal numbers. So the first thing that we always have to do is line up our decimals. So whenever we see them written horizontally like this, we need to transform it into a vertical. And when we do that, we need to make sure that all of our decimal points are lined up. Our second thing that we should do is we're going to use zeros for placeholders when we need it. So if we look at this problem, we see that there's a 3 here and there's nothing in these two place values for the first two numbers. I'm going to go ahead and add zeros. That way I know that those values are there. So to do this, I'm just going to add like I normally do. So I'm going to make sure that I put my decimal point in the same line. And then I'm going to add. So I have 0 plus 0 plus 3 gives me 3. I have 2 plus 4 plus 0 gives me 6. And I have 3 plus 4 gives me 7 plus 1 gives me 8. So my new number then is 8.63. So it's just like adding any other numbers, you just have to make sure that you keep that decimal point in line. And it's going to be the same thing for subtraction. So subtraction I have written here horizontally 11 minus 3.7. So I'm going to write that vertically, just like we always do for addition and subtraction. I need to make sure that my decimal points are lined up. And if I look at 11, my decimal point is always going to be after that number. So I'm going to make sure I put that decimal point, and I'm going to use my zeros just like before as placeholders. So well, now that I look at this, it's going to be 11.0 minus 3.7. So I'm just going to subtract. So my first thing to do is take 7 from 0. And I know that I can't do that, so I have to borrow. So this becomes a 0, and this becomes 10. So now I have 10 minus 7. Make sure I put my decimal point in the right place. So 10 minus 7 is going to be 3. And then I can move on. So 3 minus 0, I can't do that again, so I'm going to borrow. This becomes a 0, this becomes a 10. 10 minus 3 then is 7, so 7.3. And then I have 0 minus 0 gives me 0, which I can just ignore. So my new number here is going to be 7.3. And that's going to be my answer. So the two things that you have to remember with adding and subtracting is making sure that that decimal point's lined up and you keep it in line with your answer. That is with addition and subtraction. Next we're going to do is we're going to talk about multiplying decimals. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go from a horizontal problem to a vertical, just like with addition and subtraction. It's all the same. You always want to make it a vertical. Just because it's a lot easier to work with and it's the way we know how. And when I do this, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply like there are no decimals. So I'm going to take 2 times 5, which I know gives me 10. I'm going to carry my 1. 5 times 2 gives me 10 plus 1 gives me 11. I'm then going to put a 0, like always, and then I'm going to multiply by 1. So 5 times 1 gives me 5, 5 times 1 gives me 5, and I'm going to add these. When I look at this here, that's not what I want. When I look at this here, there's going to be no decimals. So there's going to be no decimals before I add it. So once I add them, 0 plus 0 is 0, 5 plus 1 is 6, 5 plus 1 is 6. I'm then going to count my decimal places. So on my first number, I have 1 spot to my decimal place. From the end of my number to my decimal place, I have 1. On my second one, to my decimal place, I'm going to count 1, 2. So I have 2. So together, I have 3 places. So I have now counted the decimal places in my factor, so I'm going to put that number in the places in my answer. So I'm then going to count from the end how many places. I have to go 1, 2, 3, and that's where my decimal point goes. So my new number is 0.63. .60. And it's fine to leave that 0 off, so you can write it as .66. So that's just something to remember with multiplying decimals, that you do not have to line up those decimal places. You multiply just like normal, and then you count the number of decimal places and add that to your answer. And last but not least, we're going to cover dividing decimals by whole numbers. So we're just using whole numbers, so we're not going to use a remainder like sometimes we do, but we're just going to use, keep adding zeros, so that way they work. I don't know why my mouse disconnected. That's okay. So the first thing we're going to look at is, this is written horizontal. I'm going to write it vertical, or in a way that we know how. So 12.5 divided by 4. So I know my 4 goes first, and then the division bar, and then 12.5. And the thing that I have to remember with this is I'm just going to move my decimal place up, and that's going to be where my decimal place is. Because we're just using whole numbers for right now, this is what I have to do. So I'm going to bring that decimal number right up. So I know that 4 can't go into 1, but I know 4 can go into 12. So 4 goes into 12 3 times. So 3 times 4 gives me 12. I have to subtract, and that gives me 0. To make sure that I bring down my next number, which is 5. And 4 goes into 5 once. 4 times 1 gives me 4, and I subtract again, and I get 1. Well, I know that I can't use my remainder from my tip above. I have to add 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a 0 after my 5 and bring down my 0. So if I bring down my 0, how many 4s go into 10? I know there's 2. So 2 times 4 gives me 8. I'm going to subtract there, and I have 2. Well, I know that I'm still okay, but I have to add another 0. So if I add another 0 and bring that down, that gives me 20. And so 4 goes into 25 times. And 5 times 4 gives me 20. And then I am done. As soon as I get a 0 in the bottom, I am done. Or if I would get a decimal that keeps repeating. And what that means is if I would have got 3.1 and then I kept only being able to go 1 and 1 and 1 and it kept going 1, you can go ahead and stop. But if it's still giving you different numbers until it repeats those numbers again, you have to keep going. So that's how we're going to not use a remainder. We're just going to use zeros. So hopefully this helps you remember the operations we can use with decimals, and make sure that you ask questions in class if you have